Friends in Christ, welcome to Sister Churches 101, a series of educational ecumenical programs that cover what the person in the pew needs to know about Orthodox Catholic relations and dialogue. Through this series of interviews, a group of summary questions with church leaders, and detailed questions with theologians and ecumenists, we hope to raise the awareness of the current Orthodox Catholic ecumenical dialogue and educate laity and diocesan clergy on the history, misunderstandings, and issues on which we agree and disagree. How did the current dialogue of the Orthodox and Catholic Church get started? What has it achieved, and why is it important?
The current dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church is a very blessed event which has gathered momentum in the second half of the 20th century. Thanks, it must be said, to the influence of the Holy Spirit, of course, primarily, but in practical terms of the two churches, some very remarkable Christian leaders. On the Catholic side, we can certainly note the great leadership of Pope John the 23rd, how providential it was that he became Pope in 1958. He was a Pope who had in his previous career worked in the papal diplomatic service, in Turkey, in Bulgaria. He was familiar with Eastern Christians, and he had a great love for Eastern Christians. Very soon after becoming Pope, he announced that he wanted to hold the Second Vatican Council, and he made it clear that that council was to be, in his purpose, in his desire, a council to restore unity among Christians. And he said very clearly, just after calling the council, just after having announced his desire to hold a council, we do not want to say who was right and who was wrong in terms of past divisions. It had perhaps often been thought that, the Catholic Church laid all the blame on the others who had broken away from the Catholic Church, and that others somehow had to repent and come back. Pope John made it clear that he didn't want to have that sort of discussion, who was right and who was wrong. Both sides, in some sense, were to blame. And so let us simply come together. This is what he said very clearly. And that is a wonderful irenic pronouncement. Then we see on the eastern side, we see the remarkable and wonderful figure of Patriarch Athenagoras. The Pan-Orthodox councils, consultations that were held in 1961 and 62 and 64, agreed that a dialogue with the Catholic Church on an equal footing should be proposed. And Patriarch Athenagoras very much was in touch with the popes, Pope John and Pope Paul VI, who succeeded in 1963, with great warmth, with great love, urging contact between the two. Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras met in Jerusalem. Can you imagine a more poignant, a more appropriate place where the Lord himself shed his blood for the world, to gather together the scattered children of God, to remember that quotation once again. How poignant to meet there and to realize how unacceptable it is that we are divided. Early 1964 they met, and that was a very historic moment. In due course, in 1965, on the penultimate day of the Second Vatican Council, on the 7th of December 1965, simultaneously in Rome and in Constantinople, a proclamation was read which revoked that mutual excommunication between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael Cerularius of 1054, and consigned it to history, to try and erase it from influencing our current relationship. And the two sides agreed that what was needed after such a long separation was a restoration of charity between them. And so a dialogue of charity was begun. In 1967, Pope Paul VI went to Constantinople. Patriarch Athenagoras came to Rome. The pictures that we still have, wonderful archive pictures of those meetings are so moving. The warmth, the friendship, the fraternal embrace between the Pope and the Patriarch. The two churches were beginning to sense the joy of being in communion with one another once again. Just beginning, of course, there was not yet full communion, but they just sensed that this was what the Lord wanted, and we must work towards this. In the fullness of time, Pope John Paul, of course, became Pope in 1978. One of the first things he did was to visit Constantinople in 1979 for the feast of St. Andrew, the patronal feast. And there, at that meeting between Patriarch Demetrios and Pope John Paul, they decided to move one step forward into the dialogue of truth, as it was called, to engage in a theological dialogue, and now to start to tackle the issues, the theological matters in our relationship. In 1980, a plan was set out by the Dialogue Commission, very much agreeing that what we had to do was to start from the points of agreement between the two sides and to consolidate that centre, to become aware of all that we share, and then gradually to work outwards from that into the difficult areas. And so that procedure was duly followed, and there were remarkable agreements in the 1980s. 1982, the first agreed statement on the mystery of the Church and of the Eucharist in the light of the mystery of the Holy Trinity. 1987, a further agreed statement on faith, sacraments and the unity of the Church. 1988, a further agreed statement dealing with apostolic succession and with ministry and with that vital aspect of the Church's life. And then pressing on further to questions of conciliarity and authority in the Church. A document was due for discussion on that. It was prepared and it was ready for discussion in 1990. But of course, at that time there was, once again, realizing the influence of politics upon this relationship, the huge political upheaval with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the opening up, the freedom from communist rule of countries in Eastern Europe. This, of course, in so many ways was something to be thankful for. One of the things that happened as a result, however, was that in the countries of Eastern Europe, many communities of Eastern Catholics who had in many instances been repressed under Soviet rule and had not been able to live their life as Eastern Catholics, reasserted themselves and said, we are Eastern Catholics and we want to function as Eastern Catholics. This issue of having Eastern Catholics at all, the whole question which is sometimes referred to as Unionism, and which has always been a cause of upset to Orthodox Christians, now, of course, inevitably became a very serious matter between us and something that needed to be addressed. And the Orthodox insisted that the existing course of the dialogue be put to one side, and this issue needed to be dealt with as a matter of priority. There was an agreement at Balamand in 1993 which stressed that Unionism is the method of union of the past, and that this is not the method of union which is to be pursued with the Orthodox for today, but there was nevertheless a very strong understanding within the Catholic Church that, of course, Eastern Catholics have a very noble history, a very noble tradition. They are to be fully respected in their own religious situation and their own allegiance, and so that was never to be questioned at all. This agreement of Balamand, it was hoped that this would perhaps settle this matter and the dialogue could be resumed, but unfortunately it didn't settle the matter. There was a further plenary of the dialogue in Baltimore in the year 2000, which really was not a successful occasion, And sadly, after that, many people thought the dialogue had simply run into the sand, and there was really a very serious situation. It was need to reassert, we might say, the dialogue of charity. And Pope John Paul, even though by this time, of course, he was infirm and he was sick, he did some remarkable things in those final years. He went to Athens and very publicly in 2001 apologized for the sack of Constantinople in 1204. All that time ago, he made public apology for that and said what a dreadful deed that was. And that, of course, the memory of 1204 had lingered, and the East still very much felt the pain of that. And this was therefore very healing for the Pope publicly to apologize for that. A little bit later, in 2004, he returned to Constantinople relics of two of the patriarchs of Constantinople, John Chrysostom and Gregory Nazianzen. And the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew was able to take those relics back to Constantinople with great joy. And they were two of his predecessors. This was a wonderful, once again, a gesture of charity between the two sides. And we might well say, I think, that in the strength of that renewed charity, the dialogue, the theological dialogue, was able to resume in 2005. And indeed the document which had been tabled, the document about conciliarity and authority from 1990, was taken up again. It was refreshed, it was revised, it was studied again, and that duly became the Ravenna document of 2007, a very, very important and valuable document. And from that Ravenna document, we are now moving into discussion of what we all recognize is perhaps the most difficult issue between us, the issue of primacy in the Church, and especially universal primacy. But with the help of the Holy Spirit, please God, and with lots of prayer and careful study and understanding on both sides, we can, please God, make progress as we seek the full restoration of communion between our churches. In other words, over these last 50 years, we have been in a remarkable and wonderful period of coming to know one another again, coming to love one another again. We have by no means come to the end of that journey and restored full communion yet, but please God, we have made good progress down that road, and we will make further progress, because this is surely the Lord's will, that we find full communion once again.
We're living in a remarkable period of dialogue. The dialogue here in North America begins in 1965. The International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue begins in 1979. In some sense, the process of alienation is beginning to be reversed. We're no longer at a point where we're avoiding each other theologically. We're no longer, in some sense, hiding from each other theologically. But officially, at the highest levels of church life, we've agreed to sit together and talk about the issues that divide us and also the issues that still continue to unite us. So I think this is a remarkable development in life of the church when you consider the centuries of alienation, the estrangement that's taken place over the course of time. Now we're living in a period where we're maybe beginning to see a gradual process of reconciliation. So just as we were torn apart over the course of centuries, years, decades, now we're being gradually brought together.
Well, we have to give credit really to the Protestants for beginning what is known as the ecumenical movement, and the Orthodox eventually associated themselves with the Council of Churches and its ecumenical dialogue, which the Catholic Church always refused to belong to and still has refused to belong to, because we consider ourselves special and apart, which in the vernacular would sometimes be called arrogance. But that's a type of exclusivity of Catholics that some Orthodox hold to, that is gradually diminishing with the development of this renewed theology of sister churches. I don't know the exact date of the beginning of our international dialogue with the Orthodox churches, but in many countries of the world there have been, ever since the Russian Revolution, especially large communities of Orthodox refugees, especially in countries like France, also in Germany. And the relations on the ground level, where the rubber hits the road, as we say, were really very good. So ecumenical dialogue began in France with the kind of sessions that used to be held between the great Russian thinkers of the emigration in France, like Berdiaev and so forth, and then a bit later people like Schmemann, and some of the Catholic scholars at that time, the immediate post-Russian Revolution era, when gradually Orthodox institutions were being established, Saint-Serge and so forth, and the relations there on the ground level developed very rapidly and were quite frequent, the contacts and so forth. The same thing occurred in the United States. I think really the ecumenical dialogue in the United States began with the old Jesuit Russian Center at Fordham University, Soloviev Hall, when the armies of Mao Zedong were at the gates of Shanghai. The Jesuits who ran a boarding school for Russian boys in the compound, the foreign compound in Shanghai, along with Russian Orthodox priests working there at the same time, they fled from Shanghai to a camp in the Philippines, an island in the Philippines, and gradually assisted their people in going to placing themselves in different countries, especially the United States, and then Brazil, Argentina, and South America, and so forth. And so these people spread around, and a certain type of collaboration and getting to know you occurred as a result of that relief effort. And the Jesuits then, finding themselves, looking for something to do, established this center in a small old army barracks with a beautiful little chapel on the Fordham University campus. And they're the ones who began in the United States to have dialogue with the professors of St. Vladimir's Seminary. And when I was a young seminarian, one of my theology professors, Edward Kilmartin, knowing my interest in the Christian East, this was long before I was ordained a priest, would bring me to some of those sessions, and that's where I met some of the greats, people like Schmemann and Meyendorff and Arseniev and so forth, who were engaged in this work. And so that was really kind of, grassroots level ecumenism that the Jesuits at Fordham began. And they themselves weren't professional theologians. They were more pastoral people who had been working among refugees. But they invited the theologians from our theology faculty, Gus Weigel and so forth, and Ed Kilmartin, as I said, and others, Matthew O'Connell. And so things sort of began in, I don't want to say natural way, because it was obviously supernatural. God was there fostering this, but natural in the sense that it wasn't organized by the hierarchy. It wasn't, the church that had to put its seal on organizing. People just said, let's get together and talk about our problems. And so, and gradually moved on from there. Now, of course, you have the Catholic hierarchy in the United States establishing dialogue with the Oriental Orthodox and Byzantine Orthodox churches. There were two separate dialogues. Years ago, I was on first one and then the other myself, and these dialogues have been extremely productive and have produced excellent literature and statements of agreement on certain points. I think it's probably the most fruitful local dialogues. The two of them are the most fruitful local dialogues going on today with representatives from the hierarchies of all churches there and so forth. The international dialogue has also, I think, taken on new life especially under Cardinal Kasper, who is now, of course, retired, and under Metropolitan Ioan Zizoulis, who both were dynamic leaders trying to move the ball down the field towards the goal, so to speak. This is going to take a lot of time for several reasons. I don't think it's unfair to our Orthodox brothers and sisters to say that in many ways the Catholic Church is much more interested in this than many of them are. Secondly, I don't think it's unfair to say that the Orthodox don't always know very well their own tradition. And they certainly don't always know what the Catholic Church teaches on things. And so if they do a bit more careful examination, then they wouldn't sometimes make the criticisms and so forth of Catholic belief without maybe finding out what that belief really is before they start throwing rocks.
Okay, well, let's see. Well, let's say why ecumenism is important, why this dialogue is so significant. We are much alike, East and West, and we have a lot to share with each other. Why is the ecumenical dialogue important? Well, of course, it's Jesus' will at the Last Supper that we be one. Why is it important? Because we have much in terms of spiritual gifts to share, and we will enable one another to become spiritually richer and more responsive to the guidance of the Holy Spirit if we are together. If we are together, we will be able to preach the gospel more effectively. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and we are agents of peace. But if we are divided and not completely at peace with one another, that works against our sharing peace in the world. And finally, I would mention in terms of the ecumenical piece of this is that we are the people who advocate for the people on the margins, the people that have no one else, the people with disabilities who are extremely poor and the like. When we are united, we're better able to care for them and advocate for them. And our witness now is divided, and we are not doing as good job as we might. Now, on the practicalities of what happened in the last 100 years or so, I would just cite two things. First of all, the encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarch in 1920. He was the first out there to say we need to be talking about Christian unity. We need to set up some organization where that can happen, a United Nations of the churches. Now, that didn't happen for a long time, but he set the tone, the Ecumenical Patriarch. And then that was one of the factors that enabled Roman Catholicism in the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s then to talk about ecumenism and to set a path, an irrevocable path, we say. This will never be reversed, that we are working toward unity, and certainly with our brothers and sisters from the East in particular, that's emphasized. So I would say that they are the two major church events. But then there's that whole background of understanding what will be gained by coming together. Well, a whole lot for a lot of people, and not just for ourselves, but for the people we're called to be serving.
The ecumenical movement itself is something going back to the beginning of the 20th century, and to a large extent is the creation of the Orthodox churches. The Catholic Church didn't participate in ecumenism in any official or effective way, and I'm sure historians will be able to correct my mistakes here, until the Second Vatican Council decree on ecumenism. And I think that was a watershed for the entire Christian world, when the Roman Catholic Church finally decided that being in communion only with itself was not going to suffice to consider itself ecumenical. Ecumenical, I mean, having to do with the whole household of God. And so, beginning in the 60s, effectively, the 1960s, dialogues got started, rethinking got started. There was a great ferment that affected Eastern Catholic churches as well, because it was in that context that the Second Vatican Council document, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, could appear and change the whole orientation of the Catholic Church with regard to Eastern Catholics in communion with the Roman See. Very, very important for us, and a matter of really helping us define who we are as Eastern Catholics in this flow of the ecumenical movement that's been going on for just under 100 years.
Getting back to the dialogue, what major things do you think it's achieved?
Well, it's brought theologians together, it's brought bishops together, the official dialogue. The declarations themselves have been steps forward in almost every respect. With even the difficulty that has arisen with the dialogue itself since the fall of the communist world, and the Balaman Declaration and its rejection by the hierarchs of my church in Romania, even the difficulties that we have point to, I think, the road ahead and ways to go. Clearly, the problem of uniatism needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved in an effective way, a Christian way. Perhaps we can talk about this later. But I would say it does not need to be resolved on the back of the uniats themselves.
Let me start with the last point. Why is it important to have a dialogue? Here I call to mind some words of Cardinal Sunans. If we are to unite, we must first love one another. If we are to love one another, we must first get to know one another. That, in the simplest possible way, sums up the whole ecumenical endeavour. Now, dialogue is a way of getting to know one another. Unless we talk to each other, we remain strangers one to the other. Unless we talk to each other, unless we listen to the other side, we will not properly understand the viewpoint of the other. We attribute to other people all kinds of views that they don't actually hold. So dialogue is part of the vital process of getting to know one another. Without dialogue, we cannot build up that mutual knowledge which is a fundamental presupposition to mutual love. Love for people whom we don't know at all is not real love. Love has to be for the people whom we know. So the dialogue helps us to discover who we are. Now, the different official dialogues we have concern church leaders and theological experts. And there needs to be a discussion and interchange on that top level. But that is certainly not enough. Unity will only come about if there is an overwhelming desire for unity within the Christian people as a whole. So, we need to have lots of other contacts at different levels. I have spent most of my life teaching in a university, and therefore I believe that there needs to be not just an official theological dialogue with specifically appointed delegates, but there needs to be a broader theological dialogue between the different specialists in Christian doctrine and church history within our universities and within our theological schools. That less official dialogue has been going on for a long time. The official dialogue between Roman Catholics and Orthodox started in 1980, but there was a preparation earlier in the 20th century with the revival within the Roman Catholic Church of the study of the Fathers, patristic studies, marked by such people as Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou, and Hans Urs von Balthasar. The Orthodox love the Fathers, but we don't always know exactly what the Fathers said. And the revival of patristic studies in the Catholic Church has helped us Orthodox to understand far better our own patristic heritage. And through a joint study of the Fathers, on the Orthodox side by people such as Father George Florovsky, or Vladimir Lossky, or someone who's very much still alive, Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, our understanding theologically of the Fathers has been greatly enhanced by working with Roman Catholics. So that's another level of dialogue. Some people may think it rather specialized. I believe it's extremely important. By studying the Fathers together, we Orthodox and Catholics come to a much better understanding of our shared heritage. But certainly the desire for unity must exist not just among professional theologians. I put that in inverted commas, because theology is rarely linked with prayer. It's not something professional, but never mind. It must exist not only on that level, but it must exist on the level of our parishes, of our local Eucharistic communities. There must be meetings between our parishes. Here in the West, almost everywhere, Eastern and Western Christians exist side by side. Orthodoxy is no longer simply Eastern. It's spread all over the globe through the emigration in the 20th century. And so there need to be mutual parish visits. And another thing that is very important is it's a good thing when people are training to be priests, that they should be sent for a time to study and live in the other church. Orthodox sent to Catholic seminaries and schools, and Catholics to Orthodox schools. And it's important to catch people when they're young, as the Jesuits have always understood. When people are important and jet around the world from one conference to another, they have no real time to get to know other people. They're catching the next plane for the next conference. When people are students, they have lots of time to get to know one another. So we need to build up ecumenical friendships when people are quite young. And if we can do that among our clergy as a start, that will help. But also, I greatly value ecumenical friendships, personal contacts between lay people of our different churches. So the dialogue needs to exist on many different levels. The process of getting to know one another involves all of us.
Where do we go from here?
Happily, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, are in a very serious dialogue at the moment, theologically seeking the way forward to resolve our difficulties and, please God, to restore full communion between our churches. It must be said that, of course, ultimately it's not we who will restore full communion. We will receive the gift of full communion from the Holy Spirit. Unity is God's gift. We are trying to dispose ourselves to receive that gift and to celebrate that gift in joy with one another. That dialogue is moving forward, thanks be to God, and a great deal of careful deliberation has to be done. What I think is very crucial is to realize that that dialogue, yes, is being conducted by representatives in a particular commission, but their work is orientated towards the full communion of the wider church, of Catholics and Orthodox, and the work of that commission will not possibly succeed unless it is supported by the prayer and the desire for union of Christians in the church at large, Western and Eastern. And therefore, in every possible way, I think it's important to support the dialogue, not just with greater knowledge of the dialogue, with study of dialogue texts, but with a deep prayer for unity, prayer for the success of the dialogue, and also the practice of friendship and love between Christians, so that we promote our care for one another, our joy in one another, our appreciation for one another, and in so many ways try to build one another up in the life of the Spirit and in the unity of the Church. So the dialogue moves forward, but it must be supported and strengthened in every possible way by the prayers and the love and the energy of Christians, Eastern and Western, and we must seek in every possible way to express in the Church, in our communities, wherever we are, friendship and love and appreciation for one another.
I think we need to recognize how much has happened in the past 50 or 60 years. The churches have come closer together. The Orthodox and Catholic churches have come closer together. We have established theological dialogues where the theologians have an opportunity to discuss issues that affect the life of the church, both issues of divisions and issues that we still share in common. That's an important level. We have had many other opportunities where clergy and lay people can come together from both churches to pray together, to study together, and to engage in common acts of witness and service in the society. I think we need to encourage those opportunities. We need to encourage the theologians to do their work. We need to encourage clergy and laity to do their work in terms of continuing the prayer for unity, which is part and parcel of our liturgical traditions. We need to encourage them to look for opportunities where they can come together to pray and to study, to learn about the traditions, and to recognize that all of us, in some sense, are responsible to God to be healers, to be reconcilers, to work towards the eradication of the divisions between our churches.
The future is the will of Christ, that all should be one, as I, Father, in you, and you in me. Both Catholics and Orthodox realize that that is the future of Christianity, not division, but unity, because it's the will of God, and so we're moving towards that. We have to move towards it in prayer, we have to move towards it in honest dialogue, we have to move towards it in the education of our people. That's a real problem. There are still pockets of bigotry in our churches against people of other confessions, not just the Orthodox. And consequently, in our education, in our schools, in our catechesis and so forth, that kind of nonsense has to be really rooted out among our people. Because unless we bring the message to the grassroots, what is done on the upper level, history has shown, will just have no effect.
Well, I am an optimist. I think the future is bright. I think that we are coming closer together. We're more close together than we have been in 500 or 600 years, since there's councils that didn't get reception. But we have to keep opening ourselves to divine guidance. We have to keep praying. We have to keep working, not become discouraged, to be persevering. But if we're talking about the Eucharist and understanding the Church in terms of the Eucharist, then it certainly seems to me that we are on the right track, and that God will help us, and even some of these insuperable issues will eventually be resolved. It may take a few more decades to do this, but I do think that we are on the right track to coming together.
The dialogue is something that's required by our very nature as church. It's required by the explicit command of Jesus, explicit prayer of Jesus. We know that there's something wrong when Christians are divided. We know that we have no voice in a divided world if we cannot keep ourselves together. So whether we succeed or fail is irrelevant. That we must be on this path is very clear.
What are some practical applications for parish life and maybe local dialogue between communities?
Lunch is a good starting place. I often one of the best things about Canton, I'm the bishop of the Eparchy of St. George, as the Holy See decided to call it. There are 5 St. George churches in Stark County, Ohio. 2 Romanian, 1 Serbian, 1 Antiochian, and a Macedonian church, I believe. No, that's St. Nicola, a Greek church. So yes, it really is the Diocese of St. George. And one of the things that's wonderful about our local situation is that the Orthodox clergy in town get together every month for lunch. And they invite the only Eastern Catholics in town, clergy, actually live in Canton, are Romanians. They always make sure that they invite us. But for that monthly lunch, even when we can't get together monthly, we would be pretty much in the same boat of not knowing each other, not having any relations with each other. But because we get together, we support each parish's, activities, their dinners, their dances, and we try to keep our people together. And I think that's, it's got to start there. That's why I said, lunch is a great starting point. I think Jesus felt that way too, or otherwise he wouldn't have chosen meals as his mode of presence in the world. So I think if we start with something like that and just make it as humble and everyday, mundane as that, we've got our best start. From there, I think it's best when we disagree respectfully and find ways to speak the truth in love, as St. Paul encourages us. It's well that the Second Vatican Council, under the inspirational leadership of Blessed Pope John the 23rd, avoided condemnations, which is the hallmark of councils, because you're trying to solve a problem, so you condemn the problem. The Second Vatican Council did not do that, and because it did not do that, it's changed the tenor of the conversation going on, even, I think, perhaps, I hope, in the internal dialogues of the Eastern Orthodox churches themselves. I think there's a way forward in that starting point of refusing to condemn each other and finding ways to get to know each other. That's the most promising for the future.
At the present moment, the Catholic Orthodox dialogue is concentrating on what both sides would agree to be the fundamental problem. And that is the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, of the Pope, within the Church. We have been looking at the historical evidence in the first millennium. We've not been entirely successful in producing a joint document about this. But I hope that we will not give up, but persevere, because here it seems to me we are coming close to the central point at issue. And certainly it is a theological question, but it's also a historical question. How did the Pope exercise his ministry at the time when East and West were in full communion? I am convinced that if we can reach a common understanding on this fundamental issue, all the other points of difficulty could be much more easily solved. So I feel a sober hope, a quiet optimism, but I don't expect instantaneous results.
I'm going to combine a question here.
Go ahead.
Practically, what can the priest in the parish, the person in the pew, do to further dialogue on a lower level, on the grassroots level?
What can we all do, whether we are trained in theology, whether we are church leaders, or whether we are simply members of the laity. What can we all do? First, we can all pray for unity. Let us never forget the work of Abbe Couturier, how he established a week of prayer for Christian unity, not a week of discussions and lectures, but prayer. So that, first of all, is something that everyone can do. Pray fervently for unity, for the restoration visibly of sacramental communion. But more than that, the human animal is an intelligent animal in principle. God has given us reasoning brain, not our only faculty, but something that we should use to the full. So it is the responsibility of every Christian at least to know what is happening, to follow the different dialogues. And this means that there should be a concerted effort to make available the conclusions of our different discussions, or if there are no conclusions, at least to make available the different opinions that are being expressed on both sides, to ensure that people are informed, so that the work for unity should be a concern not of a narrow group of specialists, but of the total Christian people. That would be, to me, a second most important thing. We should know what's going on. But thirdly, we should not just know, we should carry that knowledge into effect by establishing contacts across our parishes, between our churches, on the personal and local level, by fostering ecumenical friendships, by undertaking joint schemes. We should do everything possible together, except those things which on grounds of principle we have, alas, still to do separately. But there is a huge range where cooperation is possible. So, not just prayer, though that is the heart of the matter, not just information, but shared Christian action, personal contacts, immediate friendships.